What happened in Courtroom 7 should have never happened, but it did. And what came after changed everything. Judge orders disabled veteran to stand during sentencing. Next moment leaves the court in tears. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through Courtroom 7 like a gunshot. Sergeant Keane, you will stand for this court. All eyes turned. The bailiff stiffened. The clerk froze. Sergeant David Keane didn't move. He couldn't. But what followed was something no courtroom had ever seen. Courtroom 7 at the Howe. Riverside County Courthouse had seen its share of cases, some loud, some violent, most forgettable. But today would be remembered. The chamber reeked of lemon-scented polish, barely masking years of desperation soaked into the wood. Dust clung to the limp American flag behind the judge's bench. Fluorescent lights buzzed like a warning. The defendant's seat sat a man carved from endurance. Sergeant David Keane, 34 combat veteran. His pressed khaki pants concealed what the war had taken. His left hand trembled from time to time, a lingering insult from an IED on his third tour in Iraq. His wheelchair, a weathered military issue, stood slightly out of place beside the defense table. Like everything else in this room, the system hadn't made room for someone like him. Before the war, Keane had been a physics teacher at the local high school. The kind who stayed late, coached wrestling, and inspired kids to enlist, not through words, but by example. They'd cheered when he joined after 9/11. He didn't go to war to be a hero. He went because it felt wrong not to. Today, that same man stood accused of contempt of court for missing 3 hearings tied to a minor traffic violation. The violation, swerving his hand-controlled vehicle to avoid a distracted driver. The real offense, having the audacity to ask for accommodations, requests for teleconferencing, denied. Requests to transfer the hearing to an accessible courthouse, denied. Each petition brushed aside with bureaucratic precision. Presiding was Judge Elena Brooks, 58, known for her no-nonsense courtroom. 20 years on the bench had taught her to trust the law, not emotion. Raised on military bases, she carried her own private history, but never shared it. Some said her iron discipline came from her father. Others suspected it hid a resentment she didn't dare name. Case number 23 CR 7842. State versus David Keane, the clerk announced. The judge barely looked up from the file. This is the 4th time you failed to appear, Mr. Keane. Keane's public defender, Marcus Washington, stood quickly. Your Honor, we've documented. I can speak for myself, David said, calm but firm. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't flinch, and as he laid out the inaccessible bus stops, the broken sidewalks, the 8-block distance in a wheelchair, Judge Brooks cut him off. This court is not a menu of convenience, she snapped. You will stand to receive your sentence. A hush fell, the kind that comes before something irreversible. And as David stared up at the judge, his hand slowly reached for the wheels. If this story moves you, don't just scroll past. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let moments like this live on. David didn't answer right away. He sat quietly for a moment, eyes lowered, his fingers flexing slightly around the worn armrests of his wheelchair. Then, with a quiet exhale, he began to shift his weight. The room had gone utterly still. Even the court reporter paused, her hands hovering over her stenotype machine. Marcus reached out instinctively, as if to stop him. Don't, David said softly. If this court requires it, I'll stand. The effort was immediate and visible. He gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. His left leg, the one not made of titanium and composite, trembled under his body's strain. The prosthetic made a soft creaking sound as he tried to balance on it. His face tightened, jaw clenched. He was sweating now, small beads forming along his brow despite the chill of the courtroom. But then, against all odds, he was upright. Swaying slightly, yes, unsteady, yes, but standing. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Relief, maybe, or stubborn pride. He turned his gaze toward Judge Brooks. I'm here, he said simply. I stood. The silence that followed was not admiration. It was disbelief, because the tremor started almost immediately. It began in the damaged nerves of his thigh, traveling upward like a shiver he couldn't stop. He tried to adjust, to compensate. but his good leg buckled and the prosthetic failed to hold. He collapsed sideways, his shoulder striking the defense table on the way down before he hit the floor hard. There was a gasp in the gallery. A chair scraped loudly against the tile. Marcus was at his side instantly, kneeling beside him. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. "You've already made your point." But David shook his head. "Help me up," he said through clenched teeth. "I will not lie on this floor." And then from the gallery a voice broke through. "I'll stand for him." All heads turned. The speaker was an older man in a worn Korean War veteran's cap. His hands trembled slightly, but he rose to his feet. "I know what that pain feels like," he added softly. A moment later, a woman in a postal uniform stood. "My son served with men like him. I'll stand too." And slowly others followed, one by one. The court clerk, a young journalist, the bailiff, even the stenographer. They weren't told to. They didn't look for permission. They just rose. The silence that followed was unlike any courtroom silence before it. It wasn't duty. It wasn't fear. It was something sacred. Then the door opened. A tall woman in a U.S. Army dress uniform stepped inside, her posture crisp, her gaze steady. Her presence was immediate, official, unshakable. She walked past the standing crowd without hesitation and stopped at the bench. "Colonel Jennifer Ramirez," she said, "Judge Advocate General's Corps. I've been sent by the Department of Veterans Affairs to observe these proceedings, following multiple complaints about the treatment of disabled veterans in this jurisdiction." Judge Brooks blinked. Her lips tightened, though her voice came with practiced command. "Colonel, this is an active proceeding. You have no standing to." "On the contrary," Ramirez interrupted smoothly, placing a document before the judge. "This federal order grants me observer status in any case involving service-connected disabilities. And what I've observed here in just the last few minutes is deeply troubling." For the first time that morning, the judge didn't immediately reply. Instead, she looked down at the paper, then up again at the room full of standing citizens. Some had tears in their eyes, others quiet defiance. And David Keane, still seated, still composed, watched her with something that looked almost like patience. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes, Brooks finally said, her voice thinner than usual. She banged the gavel and turned to Colonel Ramirez. "My chambers now." Inside, the door closed behind them with a weighted thud. Though no one outside heard their full exchange, courthouse staff would later say they'd never heard the judge raise her voice quite like that day. "This is judicial interference," Brooks reportedly snapped. "You cannot walk into my courtroom and undermine." Whatever Ramirez replied, it wasn't shouted. But it stopped Brooks mid-sentence. Minutes passed. When the door opened again, the judge didn't emerge right away. Inside, she sat alone, staring down at a small stack of photographs Ramirez had placed before her. They showed Sergeant Keane, in uniform, standing with his unit in Iraq. Then later, in a hospital bed, his body broken, his gaze still fierce. The last photo, receiving the Purple Heart, seated in the same wheelchair he used today. Ramirez's voice, soft but steady, had explained earlier. He dragged 2 men from a burning Humvee after the IED that took his leg. The nerve damage is permanent. Some days he can use the prosthetic. Some days the pain is too severe. Brooks didn't answer immediately. Her fingers, once firm and sure, trembled slightly as they touched the edge of the final photo. "My father was career military," she said, not to Ramirez but to the quiet space around her. He never tolerated weakness. There was no sarcasm in Ramirez's voice, only something close to grace. "With respect, Your Honor, there's a difference between weakness and disability." Brooks didn't look up, but for the first time, that morning she listened. The courtroom never fully returned to what it had been. When Judge Brooks re-entered after the recess, something in her demeanor had shifted. Her walk was slower, her posture more restrained. The crispness she had carried so rigidly earlier now softened, like fabric worn just enough to fit the shape of a person. She took her seat, glanced briefly at the gallery, still packed, and adjusted her robe. "Please be seated," she said. There was a pause. Then, slowly, the crowd obeyed. Her eyes found David Keane, who sat upright once more in his wheelchair, flanked by Marcus and the Korean War veteran who had come forward to shake his hand during the break. His face remained unreadable, but there was no hostility in it, just presence. "Sergeant Keane," she began, then paused. She glanced down at her notes, then back up, her voice quieter this time. "Mr. Keane, this court owes you an apology." The words felt heavier than any sentence she had delivered in her career. A murmur moved through the room. "In my zeal to uphold courtroom procedure," she continued, "I failed to recognize that dignity is not one-directional. The court must show the same respect it demands." She straightened the stack of papers before her, then set them aside. "The charges of contempt are dismissed. Furthermore, I am issuing an administrative order that all future proceedings involving you will accommodate your disability, including the option for video appearances when appropriate." David nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." But Judge Brooks wasn't finished. For more stories that honor quiet courage and human dignity, like this video and subscribe to stay with us. I'm also ordering a full accessibility review of this courthouse to be completed within 30 days, and I will personally oversee a revision of our procedural training to ensure no citizen is subjected to what occurred here today. Her words were even, but behind them was something more vulnerable. A recognition, perhaps, that law without empathy can become its own form of blindness. David lifted his hand slightly. "Your Honor, if I may," she nodded. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said. "Never have. What I want, what all veterans want, is the opportunity to participate fully in the society we served. Sometimes that doesn't mean exemption. It just means understanding." Brooks held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, solemn nod. "The court recognizes your point, Mr. Keane," she said. And with that, the gavel came down, lightly, this time, as if it no longer needed to shout. When David exited the courthouse that afternoon, there was a small crowd gathered on the steps. Reporters, local news crews, even a few passers-by who had heard the story and come to see the man behind. Sergeant Keane, do you have a statement?" Marcus tried to shield him, but David held up a hand. He faced the cameras calm. "What happened today wasn't about me," he said. "It was about what justice looks like, when we choose to see each other fully." The footage would go viral, within hours. But David was already gone, quietly wheeling away, unaware that the country had just met him. Only Judge Brooks remained seated, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the bench. Her voice, so steady minutes before, sounded brittle now. "Order," she said. "I will have order in this court." But no one sat. David, still on the floor, looked up, first in confusion, then in quiet understanding. With Marcus's help, he pulled himself back into his wheelchair. He straightened himself, looked at the judge. "It appears I'm standing now," he said softly. Through them, the courtroom remained silent. But it was the kind of silence that lingers long after the gavel falls. By morning, the image had already made its rounds. A man in a wheelchair facing a semicircle of standing senators. It wasn't staged, it wasn't orchestrated, but it resonated. David's testimony before the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs was supposed to be procedural, 5 minutes of legal language, a polite nod to inclusion. Instead, it became something else entirely. He had set his prepared remarks aside and spoken plainly. "I'm not here asking for pity," he had said. "I'm asking for the dignity to fully participate in the country I served, to access justice, to be seen." There were no sweeping gestures, no dramatic voice, just a quiet man who had once dragged 2 fellow soldiers from a burning Humvee, now asking a room full of lawmakers to remember what service truly meant. And they did. One by one, they stood, not because they had to, but because for the first time in a long time, they understood why they should. Within a month, the Senate passed the Veterans Accessibility and Dignity Act, unanimously. Federal buildings across the country began conducting accessibility audits. Local governments followed suit. Judge Elena Brooks volunteered to lead the Judicial Training Task Force. Not because she was told to, because she knew she needed to. The first meeting, she told the story of her father. A military man who came home from Vietnam with scars no one dared name. She spoke, not as a judge, but as a daughter who had learned too late that silence can harden into legacy. David declined interviews, declined accolades. He still taught physics 2 days a week at a community center, still helped veterans navigate, paperwork from the worn table in his modest apartment. On Memorial Day, he was invited to speak at Arlington. He kept it short. When we make space for those who've come home changed, we honor not just their service, but our own humanity, he said. Later, he wheeled himself to Section 60. He stopped at a headstone, Captain Michael Reeves, his commanding officer, his friend, the man he couldn't save. We're getting there, David whispered. Slow but real, a familiar voice joined him. Thought I might find you here. Frank Morales, the Korean War veteran who had stood first in the courtroom, stepped forward. The two men didn't speak for a moment. They just stood, one upright, one seated, among names carved in stone. You know, Frank finally said, when I stood for you that day, I wasn't just standing for now. I was standing for the times I didn't, when I should have. David didn't reply. He didn't need to. A week later, he received a message from a young soldier at Walter Reed, newly injured, lost in pain and fear. I don't know how to live like this, the message read. How did you find the strength? David sat for a long time before answering. You don't have to stand for something, he wrote. And when you can't stand alone, others will. He sent it, then turned to the photo on his wall, of that Senate chamber, of that moment, and, for the first time in months, he allowed himself a quiet smile.